The shoreline at Dunkirk didn't look like a battlefield at first glance. It looked like the end of the world. A flat strip of sand, a gray sky, smoke hanging in the distance, and lines of exhausted men stretching toward the water as if the sea itself was the only remaining border between life and extinction. They weren't marching forward. They were waiting quietly, in formation, sometimes for hours because there was nowhere else to go. Behind them, the German advance was closing in. Ahead of them, the English Channel, cold and indifferent, wide enough to drown hope in a single afternoon. And the central question that made this moment feel like a miracle, even to people who weren't religious, was simple. How do you save an army that is already trapped? If you want more evidence-led stories like this, real events reconstructed with timeline, context, and what can be verified, subscribe to the channel and leave a like now. It helps this series reach the right audience, and it keeps us making documentaries that treat history as something you can actually understand, not just consume. By late May 1940, the situation for the Allied forces in France was collapsing with a speed that stunned nearly everyone. What later generations call blitzkrieg wasn't just a military tactic. It was psychological warfare through velocity. German forces broke through defenses, exploited gaps, and surged forward in a way that made traditional planning feel useless. British and French troops found themselves pushed backward, cut off from supply lines, and squeezed toward the coast. Dunkirk, a port town in northern France, became the last available exit, not because it was ideal, but because it was the last door that hadn't been slammed shut. This is the first reason Dunkirk became miracle-shaped in public memory. It was never supposed to be a rescue story. It was supposed to be a catastrophe. The normal ending to an encirclement of this scale is surrender, massacre, or capture on a level that changes a war overnight. And capture was not a small threat. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers being taken prisoner would have gutted Britain's ability to continue fighting, possibly forcing political collapse, and it would have handed Germany a victory that felt inevitable. Dunkirk was not just a military emergency. It was a national survival crisis disguised as a beach. Inside Britain, leaders faced a brutal strategic dilemma. If you send ships, you may lose them, ships that are vital for defending the island itself. If you do nothing, you lose the army, and without the army, Britain's position becomes near hopeless. This is where history turns into a moral equation. Do you risk the tools you need for tomorrow to save the men you need today? Operation Dynamo. The evacuation began under the shadow of failure. The port infrastructure at Dunkirk was being bombed. The harbor was chaotic. The sea route was exposed to air attacks. The beaches were shallow and long, making it difficult for large naval ships to approach close enough to load men efficiently. And yet, despite those constraints, the evacuation started. Not as a grand, confident plan, but as a desperate attempt to pull as many as possible out of a trap before the trap closed completely. What makes Dunkirk visually unforgettable, the part people replay in their minds, is the image of soldiers waiting in disciplined lines on open sand while bombs fall in the distance. It feels unreal because most people assume panic would take over. But the reality of war is that fear can become routine, and men who have been pushed to the edge often cling to structure, because structure is the only thing that keeps them human. That discipline is part of why the story later gets described as miraculous. Not because discipline is supernatural, but because when conditions are severe enough, even human order feels like a kind of grace. Then there is the most famous element of Dunkirk's myth and reality blended together: the little ships. The phrase often conjures an almost biblical image: ordinary civilians taking boats into a storm of war to rescue strangers. In truth, the evacuation involved the Royal Navy and organized efforts, but it also involved a wide range of vessels, including smaller boats that could navigate shallower waters and ferry soldiers from the beach to larger ships offshore. And whether you frame it as patriotic courage, civilian duty, or something more spiritually charged, the result is the same: an operation that should have been crushed by logistics and enemy pressure kept moving forward. As the days passed, the numbers that emerged began to shock observers. Over 330,000 Allied troops were evacuated across roughly 9 days. From late May into early June 1940, that figure matters not as trivia, but as proof that the event was not a symbolic rescue, it was a massive extraction under fire, on a scale that seems almost incompatible with the conditions. And because it happened where expectations were so dark, people reached for the only language big enough to match the emotional contrast: miracle. But history doesn't let you stop at a single word. Miracle can become a way of avoiding analysis, and this series is not here to avoid it. So the honest question becomes, what actually made it possible? Was it simply courage and organization? Was it German error? Was it weather and sea conditions? Was it the limitations of air power at that moment? Was it a chain of decisions on both sides that accidentally created a narrow window in which survival could happen? The answer is not one thing. It is a convergence and alignment of variables where each piece alone is insufficient, but together they create an outcome that looks almost impossible in retrospect. And there is one particular variable, one decision, one pause in the German advance that sits at the center of the debate over why Dunkirk didn't become a slaughter. Some call it strategy, some call it hesitation, some call it a mistake, some call it providence. But whatever name you give it, it bought time, and time is the currency of rescue. There is a reason Dunkirk still feels like a story that shouldn't exist. Even if you accept that an evacuation was attempted, the deeper question is why it was allowed to succeed at scale. Encirclements are designed to end wars quickly. When an army is pinned between an advancing enemy and the sea, the logic of warfare usually becomes brutally simple. You finish the job. And yet, at Dunkirk, the job was not finished in time. A window opened narrow, unstable, and violently contested, and through that window hundreds of thousands escaped. To understand the miracle label, you have to look at the hinge moments where this could have ended differently. The most debated hinge is the German pause. As Allied troops fell back toward Dunkirk, German armored units had advanced rapidly, and momentum was on their side. Then, in the days that mattered most, the advance slowed, and in certain sectors it stopped. The reasons for that pause have been argued over for decades, and the arguments themselves are part of the story because they reveal how history becomes mystery when outcomes feel disproportionate. Some explanations are strategic. Commanders worried that tanks were outpacing infantry support, that supply lines were stretched, that the terrain, marshy ground and canal networks could bog down armor or expose it to counterattack. Others emphasize command dynamics, competing priorities, caution after earlier losses, uncertainty about the best path forward. And then there is the explanation that most directly feeds the miracle narrative, that the pause, whatever its origin, bought the Allies. The one thing rescue operations cannot function without time. Time alone doesn't save anyone, though. The second hinge is the assumption that air power would finish the evacuation. In many accounts, the idea that the Luftwaffe could destroy ships and crush the evacuation became part of the German calculus. It sounds logical. If the enemy is trapped at the coast, you don't need to sacrifice tanks in urban fighting if aircraft can do the killing for you. But air power is not magic. It is limited by weather, by range, by visibility, by pilot fatigue, by the ability of aircraft to locate targets in smoke and chaos, and by the defensive capacity of the forces being attacked. Dunkirk's beaches were not a neat target. They were a sprawling, shifting mass of men and vessels. Smoke and haze could hide movement. The sea can make distances deceptive. And the British were not passive. RAF sorties, naval anti-aircraft fire, and constant adaptation reduced the Luftwaffe's ability to deliver the decisive, clean destruction that the theory of air dominance promised. This is a key point for your documentary tone. Dunkirk was not a single miracle event. It was a chain of contested advantages that never fully became decisive. German ground pressure existed, but did not close the trap fast enough. German air power inflicted serious losses, but did not annihilate the evacuation corridor. British and French troops were trapped but did not collapse into chaos. The sea route was exposed, but remained usable. If any one of these balances had tilted harder in the wrong direction, the story would be remembered as a disaster rather than a deliverance. Then there's the third hinge, logistics, which is where the myth of Dunkirk often turns into something more grounded and, in a way, more impressive. The popular image is that small civilian boats did the rescue by themselves, a swarm of ordinary heroes rescuing soldiers from the waves. The reality is more layered. The Royal Navy coordinated a vast operation. Large destroyers and transports carried huge numbers, and the smaller craft played a critical role in bridging the shallow water problem, ferrying men from beaches to larger ships that couldn't come close. The little ships are not a fairy tale, they are a component. But the real miracle, if you want to call it that, is that a complex system formed under pressure. Military coordination, civilian participation, improvisation, repeated crossings, repairs, rerouting, and constant replanning as conditions changed, and conditions did change. Dunkirk's port facilities were damaged. The harbor was dangerous. Yet a lifeline emerged in unexpected ways, including the use of structures like the long breakwater, an industrial piece of infrastructure, not designed for mass evacuation, that became a loading route. This is the kind of detail that belongs in a documented case episode because it shows how survival sometimes comes from repurposing what already exists. The environment doesn't become kind, people become adaptive. Another reason Dunkirk carries the flavor of a miracle is the behavior of the trapped troops themselves. People often imagine a trapped army as a panicked mob. Dunkirk was crowded and terrifying, but it also displayed organization lines, discipline, controlled movement, because order was a survival technology. When you're trapped, your instincts scream at you to run, but running doesn't create ships. Running doesn't lower the sea. Running doesn't solve shallow water. Structure does. Coordination does. So you had thousands of men doing the one thing that looks almost unnatural in such a situation: waiting. That waiting is often described as stoic or eerie, and it becomes part of the mythos because it feels like a collective act of restraint at the edge of extinction. But here's the honest documentary tension. If you explain Dunkirk as they were brave, they organized, they improvised, you still haven't addressed why the window stayed open long enough. This is where the debate over the German pause returns with full weight. Because bravery and logistics can create a rescue plan, but only the enemy's failure to close the gap allows the plan to complete. Whether that failure was a miscalculation, a strategic decision that backfired, a terrain-driven constraint, or a convergence of command choices, is exactly what historians argue about. And that argument is why Dunkirk remains compelling. The outcome forces you to stare at how often history turns on decisions that seemed reasonable at the time and catastrophic in hindsight. This is also why the miracle label persists even in a modern secular world, because a miracle, culturally, is often an outcome that feels like it required help from beyond the visible chain of causes. Dunkirk doesn't require you to believe in the supernatural to feel that way. It only requires you to recognize how many things had to go right, or, more precisely, how many things that could have gone wrong did not go wrong soon enough to end it. From a distance, Dunkirk is often described with one-word: evacuation, but in real time, it didn't feel like a single operation. It felt like a slow, grinding extraction with the ocean as the only corridor and the sky as a constant threat. The beach was not a cinematic set. It was a waiting room for death that, somehow, kept producing departures. Men stood in long lines that stretched toward shallow water, stepping forward in small increments as boats came and went. Some boarded vessels directly. Many had to wade out, sometimes chest-deep, to reach smaller craft that could shuttle them to larger ships anchored offshore. And over all of it, over sand, water, and smoke hung the awareness that the next wave of aircraft could erase everything. What makes Dunkirk so difficult to process is that it combined two emotional realities that rarely coexist. On one hand, it was organized: cues, schedules, procedures, signals, coordination. On the other hand, it was chaos: bombs, fires, sinking ships, the wounded, the exhausted, the uncertainty of who would make it onto a boat and who would not. That coexistence is part of why people later spoke about Dunkirk as if it had been held together by something beyond human control. Because when the environment is hostile enough, even a functioning system feels miraculous. The sea crossing itself was not a simple trip from point A to point B. Every vessel carried the risk of being targeted, and the channel is not a forgiving place when ships are hit. A sinking at sea is not only a military loss, it becomes a test of endurance for the men in the water. Cold, shock, fear, darkness, these are the elements that don't appear on a map, but decide outcomes. Many men made it across. Many did not. The losses matter in this story because they keep the narrative honest. Dunkirk was not a clean escape. It was a rescue under punishment. And yet, the numbers climbed in a way that surprised even those coordinating the operation. This is where the documentary weight of the case comes through. The scale wasn't symbolic. It wasn't a few hundred men slipping away under cover of night. It was hundreds of thousands moved across a narrow sea under enemy pressure. When those figures became known, the psychological meaning of the event changed instantly. The public instinct is to treat evacuations as retreats, as defeats. But the scale created a new possibility, to reinterpret what had happened not as collapse, but as preservation, not as surrender, but as survival. This is the emotional pivot that made Dunkirk politically and culturally explosive. Britain, watching its army nearly destroyed, suddenly saw proof that the army still existed. It had been forced out, yes, but it had not been erased. And when a nation is at risk of losing its ability to fight, the return of its soldiers becomes more than logistics. It becomes a story of identity. The men coming back were not simply troops disembarking from ships. They became a symbol that the war was not over, that the island was not yet beaten, that the future was still negotiable. But the most fascinating detail, especially for a channel built around the boundary between miracle and mechanisms, how the language around Dunkirk shifted in real time. Many people at the time spoke openly in religious terms. Public calls to prayer were part of the atmosphere in Britain, and the framing of Dunkirk as deliverance wasn't invented decades later. It emerged from the moment itself, because when a nation watches the edge of annihilation and then sees life return, it reaches for the deepest language it has. For some, that language is strategic analysis. For others, it is providence. Often, it is both at once. We did what we could, and something larger allowed it to work. This doesn't mean the rescue was mystical. It means that belief is how many societies process improbable survival at scale. If your worldview includes God, Dunkirk looks like an answered prayer. If your worldview is secular, Dunkirk looks like a rare alignment of constraints, miscalculations, and human adaptation. Both positions can accept the same timeline and still reach different conclusions, because the disagreement isn't about what happened, it's about what it means. And meaning had immediate consequences. After Dunkirk, Britain's war posture shifted. There was relief, but also clarity. The evacuation had saved men, not equipment. Much was left behind: vehicles, heavy weapons, supplies, because, in a trap, you do not evacuate objects, you evacuate lives. This is another reason Dunkirk is remembered with such intensity. It was deliverance, but it was deliverance with a bill attached. The army survived, but it returned stripped down, forced to rebuild. The miracle saved the body. The body still had to heal. On the beaches, not everyone was saved. That truth sits underneath every triumphant retelling. There were those who held positions to buy time. There were those who never made it onto a boat. There were those captured as the perimeter tightened. The evacuation was immense, but it was not total, and that is precisely why Dunkirk remains morally complex. When you call something a miracle, you risk implying that the story has no tragedy, no loss, no cost. Dunkirk had all of those. The miracle, if you use that word, is not that no one suffered. It is that, despite suffering, the outcome was not the worst one. Now, as the evacuation neared its end, the final days carried a different kind of tension. Early success creates a dangerous illusion that the operation will keep working, but rescues often become harder as they progress, because the easiest extractions happen first, and the remaining situations are more exposed, more desperate, more constrained. As the window narrowed, every additional shipload became more valuable, and every delay became more terrifying. Dunkirk wasn't one escape. It was an escape repeated until the corridor finally closed. By the time the evacuation ended in early June 1940, the outcome had already taken on a life larger than the operation itself. Hundreds of thousands had escaped a trap that, by ordinary military logic, should have ended in capture or annihilation. The term miracle wasn't simply a poetic label added decades later. It became part of how people processed the emotional shock of the result, because the contrast between expectation and outcome was too extreme to describe with neutral language. When you expect catastrophe and receive deliverance, your mind either calls it luck, or strategy, or providence because it needs a category big enough to hold the difference. For a channel built on documented cases, the honest way to land this story is to separate the layers. The first layer is what we can say with confidence. Dunkirk happened. Allied forces were trapped against the coast. Operation Dynamo evacuated a massive number of troops across the English Channel over a short window, under air and artillery threat, while the port and surrounding area were under attack. The operation did not unfold safely. Ships were hit and men died. Yet the evacuation achieved a scale that preserved Britain's ability to continue the war. That's the documented backbone, a real emergency, a real extraction, a real consequence for the future of the conflict. The second layer is what is plausible as explanation mechanisms that make the outcome possible without requiring anything supernatural. And here, the answer is not a single cause. It is an alignment. It includes the logistical improvisation that allowed men to be moved even when the harbor was damaged and the shoreline was shallow. The disciplined behavior that reduced chaos on the beaches, the coordinated effort between naval assets and smaller craft, and the constant adaptation as conditions changed. It also includes the limits of air power and the way smoke, weather, operational constraints, and defense can reduce even a strong air force's ability to deliver a clean, decisive blow. Plausible here doesn't mean easy. It means you can trace how the rescue could work if enough people make enough correct decisions under pressure. But the third layer, the one that keeps Dunkirk in the category of miracle for so many, is the hinge that remains debated: why the trap didn't close fast enough. This is where historians and commentators focus on the German pause and the strategic calculus behind it. Was it caution about terrain and overextended armor? Was it a choice to let air power finish the job? Was it command friction and mystery? Was it a cluster of reasonable decisions that became disastrous in hindsight? The fact that there isn't one universally satisfying explanation is part of why the story stays alive. When an outcome is this large, and the enemy's failure to stop it feels disproportionate, people sense a missing piece. And that missing piece is exactly where belief enters. For many in Britain, at the time, Dunkirk wasn't only a military event. It was a moral and spiritual moment. Public prayer, the language of deliverance, the feeling that the nation had been spared. Those were not invented by later storytellers. They were part of how the moment was lived. And that's important, because it means the miracle framing isn't only a modern clickbait label. It is a historically grounded psychological reaction. When you watch your army almost vanish and then return, you will interpret it through the deepest lens you possess. For some, that lens is God's providence. For others, it is probability, weather, and human systems. Either way, the emotional verdict has a logic. The survival felt larger than the sum of its parts. So what remains inexplicable, even when you know the timeline? Not the logistics, not the geography, not even the broad strategic arguments. What remains inexplicable is the alignment itself, the way multiple fragile advantages held together long enough to produce a result that reshaped the war. This is why Dunkirk functions as a miracle story, even for people who reject supernatural explanations. Because even in a secular frame, you are left with a kind of awe, the sense that history can pivot on narrow windows, and that those windows can open where you least expect them. And this is the takeaway that matters beyond the war. Dunkirk teaches a principle that applies to every documented miracle in this series. Sometimes confirmation of the timeline does not remove wonder, it simply relocates wonder. You move from how did that happen, to how did all of that happen at once, under that pressure, without collapsing. The more you understand the constraints, the more the outcome feels improbable. That's the paradox. Knowledge does not always shrink the miracle. Sometimes it sharpens it. If you want to keep following this series into cases where the boundary between documentation and belief gets even thinner, where the evidence is less mechanical and more human, built from eyewitness accounts, public records, and decades of debate, then the next episode should take us into a reminder that miracle isn't only survival. Sometimes miracle is mass witness testimony tied to a place and date that became globally famous. And the question becomes, not how did they escape, but what did thousands claim they saw, and why do people still argue about it? That next case will force an even stricter standard of evidence, and it will test the line between faith and documentation in a different way. If you watched this entire story, subscribe and leave a like, because it helps these episodes reach people who care about history told with clarity and weight. And comment below with your honest view. Was Dunkirk a miracle in the divine sense, a miracle in the human sense, or simply a rare alignment of war decisions and circumstances? And which hinge moment in this timeline matters most to you?